Hi there. Welcome to Exit to Excel. I'm Latanya, an executive HR leader and career strategist with over 25 years of experience. I've also sat on both sides of the interview table. I've been the one making hiring decisions, reading candidates, deciding who moves forward and who doesn't. And I've been the one preparing, rehearsing, walking into a room and hoping that I brought the best version of myself so that I could be chosen. Now, this dual perspective is the foundation of this podcast, and today's episode draws from it directly. We're talking about interviews, not the mechanics, though, but the mindset. Specifically, the difference between showing up and hoping to be chosen and showing up having already decided who you are and what you bring, because that difference is everything. And most people never really think about it that way. So let's get into it. Think about the last time you prepared for a significant interview. Like me, you probably put a lot of time into it. You spent time researching the company, trying to think through the questions they might ask you, and you rehearse your answers so that you're able to say specifically what you outlined. Maybe you even went through and had someone conduct a mock interview with you, or you practiced alone trying to get the phrasing just right because you felt like you wanted to be walk in ready to perform. And then the interview starts. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you start running through different scenarios and questions. Am I responding well? Am I saying the right things? Am I talking too much? Am I not saying enough? Am I coming across confident, or am I coming across as someone who's desperate? So by the time you wrap up your interview, you're not sure how it went. And then you start replaying the whole interview over and over again in your head, picking apart the moments that felt off. So, this loop, the loop that you're going over and over in your head, the over preparing, the second guessing, the waiting, it feels so familiar that most people assume that that's just part of the interviewing process. Like it is what it is. That's the experience. But here is what I want to offer you today. That loop that you go through is a signal. And it's not a signal that you're bad at interviews, but it's a signal that you've been approaching them as an audition, as a performance where someone else holds the verdict. And when the most effective interviewers approach them as a conversation, they enter those situations prepared to lead. Now, that shift sounds simple, but it changes everything. It changes everything from how you prepare, how you carry yourself, how you recover when something happens in the interview, and how you feel walking out the door. And that's what we're talking about today. So, here's what I've observed across hundreds of hiring conversations on both sides of the table. Most people walk into interviews in a fundamentally reactive posture. They're responding. They're waiting for each question to arrive. Then they're trying to think through the best possible answer that they can give. And they're managing their impression in real time. And they're adjusting their responses and even their body language based on the cues of the interviewer. And they'll sit there wondering, even mid sentence, whether what they're saying is landing, whether it's resonating, whether they're making the right impression. Now, in case you have not noticed, that reactive posture in interviews is so exhausting. And it almost always produces a version of you that is smaller than the version that actually exists. Because here's what happens: most of us receive a consistent implicit message early in our careers. And that is, interviews are about being evaluated, where someone is deciding whether you're good enough. And your job in those situations is not to mess up, to be likable, and to give them a reason to say yes, to give them a reason to choose you. Now, for many professionals, and particularly for women and for people who've had to work harder than their counterparts just to be seen, that message runs deep. And it shows up not as obvious self doubt, but as over preparation for the wrong things. Rehearsing answers instead of clarifying your narrative, anticipating objectives instead of grounding your value. And the job market in 2026 that we're seeing right now adds yet another layer. When the job search has been longer than expected, when applications have gone quiet, when interviews have come and gone without offers, that history, all of that history weighs on you and how you walk into the next room. It's interesting that, when I was part of my job groups and in the outplacement companies and people who had been going through the cycle for so long, I could almost tell immediately those that had been in a program going through this for 8, 9, 12 months versus someone who was early in the process because the history was weighing on them. It weighed on them in their body language. It weighed on them in the way that they spoke about the experience. And you have to know that that is coming through in your interviews. There's a pull towards being more agreeable and more flexible and more of whatever it is that they need because the cost of not getting that one feels very high. And that's the trap. I've watched very smart, experienced, genuinely exceptional professionals fall into this trap. And it's not because they lack the ability, but because the pressure of the moment shifts their orientation from grounded authority to managed anxiety. And the result is that the interviews become performances. And performances are exhausting. They're exhausting, they're inconsistent, and they're almost always less compelling than simply being clear. Now, when I moved into senior roles in HR and senior leadership positions, I started noticing a very specific pattern in hiring. The candidates who got hired, the ones who generally shifted the energy in the room, they weren't always the most credentialed or the most experienced that we were meeting with, but they were the ones who showed up very clear about their value. They didn't apologize what they had accomplished. They didn't over explain or seek permission to take up space. They stated facts and they asked real questions. And get this, they evaluated us as much as we evaluated them. And to be honest with you, that made them even more attractive and made us even more urgent in us sealing the deal, right? Not them, but us as an organization. And I noticed something else. The moment that that dynamic entered into a room, everyone felt it. It just felt different. Because when someone walks in who doesn't need your validation, who is stating rather than asking, who is leading rather than auditioning, the entire conversation changes. And they move from a candidate who is interested and who needs a job to someone who is exactly who we're looking for. And I also noticed something harder to sit with: the candidates who were shrinking in interviews, the ones who were often doing extraordinary work once they were hired. The intelligence was real, their expertise was real, and their leadership capacity was real. They just weren't showing it during the interview because somewhere along the way they had learned that showing it fully was risky. And I remember that feeling. I lived it myself early in my career, learning to soften my directness, learning to soften my passion, to over explain, to earn the right to take up space before taking it. And over time, I understood exactly what was happening. Now, it did take some time and a number of experiences, but then I was able to understand what was happening. And I understood what it was costing me, and I understood what it was costing other people that were doing this. So, what we call interview skills at its core really is permission to show up as yourself. And the work is figuring out when and how you learn not to and deciding that ends now. So, here's the shift. An interview is not an audition where you hope to be selected. It is, though, a high stakes conversation between two parties just trying to determine if there's a fit there. Two parties, each party determining whether there is a fit. You are evaluating them as much as they are evaluating you. And when you walk in with that type of orientation, genuinely is not a performance of confidence, but as a grounded belief. And when you are able to frame it in that manner, the entire dynamic of the conversation changes. The professionals who interview most effectively aren't necessarily the most polished or even the most rehearsed. It's quite the opposite, actually, because they tend to be the clearest and they are very confident in knowing what they bring and they know what they need. They know what worlds and situations and organizations they won't thrive in. And because they know those things, they're not reacting to the conversation. They're actually participating in it as an equal. That clarity shows up in three specific moments, and I want to name them not as a formula, but as orientation points so that you know what to look for. These are places where you either lead the narrative or you hand it to someone else. The first place this happens is your opening. Most people treat the tell me about yourself as a walk through their resume, a chronological explanation that ends with them hoping that the interviewer discovers their value buried inside it. Your opening is not an explanation, it is a declaration. It names what you do, who you serve, and what you bring to the specific conversation. And when you're able to do this clearly, you've established something very important. I know my own value, and I'm not waiting for you to find it. I have told my clients I like for them to give themselves is it called a moniker or a title that they are known by or what they would like to be known by. I think that's an outstanding way to open up the conversation. And when I shared that with them, we went through that exercise, they felt so much more confident in their ability to be able to answer that question or that request, tell me about yourself, in a way that was powerful, impactful, and immediately got their attention and demonstrated value. So I will talk more about that later on. But let's talk about the second way you either continue to own the narrative or you give it away. The second is how you carry your proof. Every strong answer into an interview contains three things: the problem you faced, the thinking you applied, and the outcome you moved. Most of you may know this as the STAR method. It's just a little condensed here. So it's not theory and it's not a list of responsibilities, but it is proof that you move things. You make things happen. Because when you lead with that consistently, you stop asking someone to discover your value. You are clearly demonstrating it. And that's not arrogance, but it is clarity. Now, the third place where you tend to either control the narrative or give it away is how you close. Strong interviewers don't end conversations by waiting to see if the interviewer got it. Oh, you have any questions for me? Or just merely asking next steps and that kind of thing. They close it by reinforcing fit, by naming directly why this role and this moment makes sense given what they bring. That close in the act of leadership. It says, hey, I've listened, I've heard what you said that you need. I know what I deliver. And so, hey, let's figure out if this is a match. Now, across all three of these moments, your opening, your proof, and your close, the underlying shift is the same. You stop competing for permission to be seen and you start leading someone towards a clear decision.